borrow from a big Brazilian hit.
Rod Stewart, the iconic voice that gave the world Maggie May and Do You Think I'm Sexy, is more than a legendary rock singer. He is a whirlwind of emotion, a storm of gravel and gold who has carried the weight of rebellion, heartbreak, and joy in his voice for over 6 decades. His sound, both rough and intimate, shaped the pulse of multiple generations. But behind that unforgettable rasp lies a life that has been anything but easy. From the start, Rod Stewart seemed destined for more than just fame. He was knighted, adored, and held up as an emblem of defiance. Yet, for all the moments that crowned him a musical king, his journey has been marked just as much by private anguish as it has by public triumph. Twice he stood at the brink, thyroid cancer once silencing the very thing that made him who he was, and later, prostate cancer threatened to take him entirely. But Rod didn't bow to fate. He battled through it, bled through it, and emerged each time with voice and spirit intact. Now, as he edges toward 80, something darker stirs in the backdrop. This isn't just about the passing of time or the wear and tear of the spotlight. This is a silence more haunting than any stadium crowd could drown out. It's the weight of memories of what was lost along the way, the loved ones, the regrets, and a question that now lingers louder than any chorus. When the music ends, what remains? But Rod Stewart's story didn't begin under dazzling stage lights or amidst roaring fans. It began in much humbler surroundings, far from the glitter of fame. Above a small newsagent shop at 507 Archway Road in Highgate, post-war London, a boy named Rod was born into a Scottish-English household. The youngest of 5 siblings, Rod often felt the solitude of being the last in line. His quiet encouragement etched into every hopeful glance. But dreams, like voices, can be shattered in a moment. In 1961, at the age of 16, Rod attended a trial with Brentford. The outcome was brutal. No offer, no future. It wasn't just a rejection. It was the death of a dream that had defined his boyhood. He later admitted that this moment scarred him more deeply than any heartbreak to come. With football behind him, Rod wandered. He dabbled in screen printing, delivered goods for pocket change, and even found himself working as a gravedigger at Highgate Cemetery. There, surrounded by soil and silence, he lowered strangers into the earth and began to understand how swiftly life could erase names from memory. But amidst this bleak stretch, 2 quiet passions took root. One was an intricate fascination with model railways, miniature worlds where he could control something, anything. The other was a battered guitar gifted by his father in 1959. On it, Rod began fumbling through the chords of old folk ballads, discovering that pain, loss, and longing could be translated into music. It wasn't grandeur. It was survival. He wasn't yet a star, just a boy grasping at whatever light he could find in the fog of his youth. Years later, Rod would reflect on this time not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had been dealt his first true heartbreak when football turned its back on him. But music, raw, aching, and alive, became his last chance. And from that fragile beginning, something began to grow. The silence of rejection would soon become the power behind a voice that could shake entire arenas. At 18, Rod stood on the damp streets of Leicester Square, his harmonica in one hand and guitar in the other. His voice, unpolished but unmistakable, cut through the noise of London streets. Passers-by tossed coins into his cap, not out of pity, but out of recognition. There was something real in his sound, something desperate yet defiant. They began to call him Rod the Mod, for his look, his swagger, and the suits that tried to mask the ache of invisibility. But behind that confidence lived a boy still haunted by the silence of Brentford's rejection. In 1963, but always as an accessory, a voice without a name. This pain, sharper than the rejection from Brentford, etched itself into his soul. Music hadn't rejected him like football had, but it teased him with recognition while keeping true validation just out of reach. Rod wasn't invisible anymore, but he still wasn't seen. And for someone who had spent his life clawing toward visibility, This half-success was agony. Yet within that torment, something crystallized, a vow. He would not live in another man's shadow. He would not be remembered merely as a backup to brilliance. Somewhere inside that voice, shaped by loss, sharpened by rage, grew a promise. One day, the album topped charts in both the UK and the US, launching him into an elite circle of rock legends. The 1970s and 1980s became Rod's golden decades. Each release was a seismic event. Tonight's the night. You're in my heart. Do you think I'm sexy? His raspy voice echoed through radios and arenas from London to Tokyo, filling coliseums and rattling rafters. Not seen for the man he was, only for the image they projected onto him. Rod the mob, Rod the caricature, Rod the excess. Behind the scenes, it wasn't glamour. It was grief. The same man who thrilled crowds with swagger and charm sat alone backstage, the echo of the audience's roar fading into deafening silence. He had gained the world, but felt increasingly distant from himself. He would later say, "The summit is the coldest place of all." Every chorus became a kind of confession. The leopard print suits dazzled the crowd, but the pain behind the voice gave the songs their soul. If you listened closely beneath the horns and drums, you could still hear the ache of a man who had been overlooked, mocked, and betrayed, and yet refused to be silenced. Rod Stewart's music was not just entertainment. It was endurance. It was survival. And as he entered the 1980s, that survival would be tested like never before. Not by critics, but by the ghosts of his own past, waiting to haunt him in ways no fame could shield him from. For all the stages Rod Stewart had conquered, for all the headlines and the #1 singles, there was one chapter of his life that had remained buried, not in secrecy, but in sorrow. It was a wound older than his fame, deeper than his career, and it began long before the spotlight ever found him. In 1963, at just 18 years old, before Maggie May, before stardom, before even the hope of a future in music, Rod became a father for the first time. His daughter, Sarah, was born into a world of chaos. He had no home, no steady income, no means of providing even the basics. His life, then, was a blur of odd jobs and late-night busking, sleeping wherever he could, with desperation in his heart and no support system to speak of. It was a confession not born from defensiveness but from anguish, the guilt of a young man who hadn't yet found his way and lost his child because of it. As his fame soared in the late 60s and early 70s, the roar of the crowd only amplified the silence he carried inside. With every sold-out arena, every chart-topping hit, there was still the echo of what he had left behind. Sarah was out there, somewhere, living a life he could never touch. And that truth haunted him. For Sarah, too, the years were filled with quiet questions. Raised by a loving adoptive family, she knew something in her life had always been missing. Occasionally, that's something you don't get back. And Sarah, with equal vulnerability, said, "Meeting him was like touching a part of myself I'd been searching for all along." Their reunion was not a fairy tale. It was not polished for the press. It was raw, honest, and incomplete, but real. And in that realness came healing. For Rod, this was the wound that had shaped every verse he ever sang, the one sorrow no fame could ease. For Sarah, it was a chance to rewrite a part of her identity, to connect not to the legend, and the fragile hope of redemption. In 1979, at age 34, Rod married actress Alana Hamilton. To the world, it looked like a perfect match, a rock star and a Hollywood beauty, wrapped in the glamour of Beverly Hills. Soon after, they welcomed 2 children, Kimberly and Sean. For Rod, this family represented a second chance, a chance to be present. It was a betrayal of the promise he had made to himself, that he would never let another child feel the absence that Sarah had endured. But here he was again, signing papers that would split his home, watching his children grow from a distance, caught in a cycle he swore he'd break. He later confessed, "It's hard to hold it together when the whole world feels like it belongs to you, but your home doesn't." That pain only deepened with time. Kimberly, raised in the spotlight, carried the weight of celebrity culture. Her childhood played out in front of flashbulbs and tabloid whispers. Sean, more private, struggled more visibly. Addiction, run-ins with the law, stints in rehab. Rod watched it all with a heartbreak he could barely put into words. To love your children deeply and still feel helpless in the face of their pain. That, for Rod, was the worst torment of all. He did not sugarcoat these years. He didn't portray himself as perfect, nor did he place blame elsewhere. He admitted the truth. He had been seduced by success, and in the process, lost sight of what mattered most. But life, for all its cruelty, often offers another chance. And Rod, ever the romantic, reached for it again. In mid-1980s, Rod fell in love with Kelly Berg, a model whose gentle spirit seemed to promise calm in the midst of chaos. In 1987, they welcomed a daughter, Ruby. For a moment, it felt like the redemption he had always longed for. He spoke often of how holding Ruby softened something in him, how her laughter brought warmth to his restless soul. But patterns have a way of repeating. Fame once again intruded. By 1989, the relationship had quietly ended. It wasn't scandalous, just sad. Another home broken. Another child growing up in two worlds. Another vow shattered by the roar of crowds. Rod admitted later, "I thought I'd learned. I thought I could finally hold on to something. But I was wrong." Ruby would grow up with love, yes, but also with longing. In interviews, she spoke kindly of her father, but also honestly. "I knew he loved me, but sometimes it felt like he belonged more to the world than to us." Rod, hearing those words, felt their weight. Once again, he had been pulled in two directions, by the audience who adored him and the family who needed him. The hardest role of all, he later said, was never the performer. It was being a father, a steady. When Rachel Hunter entered his life in 1990, Rod allowed himself to hope again. She was only 21 at the time, a New Zealand supermodel whose beauty seemed almost untouchable. Her presence captivating in a way that felt like destiny. He was 45, weathered by decades of fame and failure. She was radiant and new. For Rod, their connection felt less like a romance and more like a second beginning. Their wedding was a spectacle, the kind only rock royalty could produce. Headlines called it a fairy tale, a merging of two worlds. But for Rod, it was something even deeper. It was redemption. This time, he believed things would be different. This time, the past would not repeat itself. Together, they had two children, Renee, born in 1992, and Liam in 1994. Their births filled Rod with a joy he hadn't felt in years. Holding them, he felt the weight of all his old wounds, and for a moment, it seemed that the cycle had finally broken. The family he had longed for, the kind he had chased through 3 decades, now felt real and within reach. In public, Rod and Rachel were the picture of a modern-day dream. The rugged rock legend and the graceful young muse, often photographed hand in hand, their home filled with birthday candles, bedtime rituals, and poolside laughter. Rod seemed calmer, grounded. He began to believe he had finally found his anchor, not in fortune, not in fame, but in fatherhood. But reality, as always, chipped away at the fantasy. The difference in age, nearly 25 years, which had once added novelty, slowly began to create distance. Rod's schedule remained relentless. Tour after tour, album after album. Rachel, barely in her own adulthood, began to realize how much of her identity was being consumed by the gravity of Rod's world. And though the public saw magazine covers and red carpets, behind the doors, the cracks had begun to spread. Rod would later reflect with piercing honesty. We were living in 2 different worlds. In 1999, after nearly a decade together, Rachel left. The news sent shockwaves through fans and stunned Rod to his core. This wasn't just another breakup. This was the one that broke something deeper than his heart. It broke his belief in love itself. "I thought she was the one forever," he said simply. "I was wrong." He did not villainize her. He did not excuse himself. What he offered, instead, was raw honesty. With Rachel, he had believed in forever. And when she walked away, He wasn't just mourning a marriage. He was mourning the idea that he could ever get it right. Friends described him in those months as emotionally adrift, a man haunted by the question, if not this, then what? Worse still, the heartbreak echoed beyond the two of them. Renee was only 7, Liam just 5, too young to understand why their parents no longer lived in the same house, but old enough to feel the splinter, old enough to carry that ache with them into adulthood. In later years, both Renee and Liam would speak gently but honestly about those times. There was love, yes, but also absence, confusion, and longing. They had grown up in fractured homes, despite a father who had sworn to himself that no child of his would ever feel what Sarah had once felt. For Rod, this was the cruelest blow of all. Not only had he failed again, but he had passed on the pain. The very sorrow he had worked so hard to overcome was now mirrored in his children's eyes. Looking back, he did not romanticize that era. He admitted it broke him. After Rachel, he closed himself off, guarded his heart, distrusted intimacy. For years, he armored himself in suits and charm, still performing, still dazzling crowds, but inside, a man quietly grieving the loss of something he had once believed was unbreakable. If Sarah's absence had left him scarred, and Alana's divorce had fractured his identity, then Rachel's departure left him stripped of hope. It was the moment the eternal romantic stopped believing in romance. But life, in its strange mercy, what she offered was steadiness, something Rod had never known in a partner. At 26, Penny was far younger than Rod, but she carried no baggage of broken marriages, no trail of tabloid drama. She was calm, grounded, and above all, sincere. Their connection didn't erupt like wildfire. It grew slowly, cautiously, away from cameras and headlines. Penny didn't want to become part of Rod's spectacle. She wanted to become part of his healing. Skeptics dismissed them early on, pointing to the age gap, the history, the odds stacked against them. But Penny wasn't interested in proving anything to the world. She simply showed up, on tour, at home, in the quiet moments between concerts. She became his companion, not just in performance, but in the vulnerability of ordinary life. She gives me peace, Rod would later say, a simple sentence. But from him, it carried the weight of everything he had lived through. In 2005, it was about making breakfast. It was about school runs. It was about staying. Their marriage has lasted more than 20 years, a quiet miracle in the world of rock and roll. Not without struggle. If the vocal cord were damaged, he wouldn't just lose his career. He would lose himself. He later described those nights before surgery as some of the darkest he'd ever lived through. Alone in the silence, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the possibility that when he woke up, there might be nothing left of his voice. My voice, he whispered to himself, is all I've ever had. Without it, who am I? The surgery was successful, the cancer removed. But when Rod regained consciousness, the nightmare had only just begun. His voice was gone, not entirely, but what remained was a hushed, broken whisper. The roar that had once filled coliseums had been reduced to air. He tried to hum a note, any note, and nothing came. The silence was unbearable. A guitar sat untouched in the corner of the room. For weeks, he avoided mirrors, unable to face the reflection of a man who had once ruled the world with song, now unable to sing at all. The house echoed with stillness, mocking him, the legend of Rod Stewart. The music, the swagger, the unstoppable energy had been reduced to a man in a chair trying to make sound. The journey back was brutal. Vocal rehabilitation sessions made him feel like a child learning to speak. Every note cracked. Every scale was a climb. He slammed doors, cursed his reflection, walked out of training in frustration. I had to start again, he said later, like a child learning to walk. But it felt worse than that. I was a king crawling through ashes. It took months. Slowly, painfully, the voice began to return. Not the same voice, it was different now. Weathered, wounded, but deeper. Forged in fire. And when he finally stood before a microphone again, when that first raw note rasped into being, he cried. Not for the music, but for the miracle of sound itself. But the trials weren't over. In 2016, Rod faced another grim diagnosis: prostate cancer. By this time, he was in his early 70s, still touring, still performing, still lighting up arenas with the energy of a man half his age. But now, he carried a secret that few knew. He kept it hidden from fans, from the media. Only Penny and his children knew the truth. For 3 years, he fought it quietly. No public declarations, no press statements, just quiet endurance. He smiled through interviews, danced through concerts, and laughed on camera, all while knowing that something dark and merciless was growing inside him. "I didn't want the sympathy," he would say later, "and I didn't want to scare the kids." But the fear was real, not for himself, but for them. Night after night, after the encore and the after-parties, he lay awake in dark hotel rooms, staring at the ceiling, haunted by a single question: will I live long enough to see my boys become men? Treatment began. Radiation, targeted therapy. It drained him. Some mornings, he couldn't even stand. The sequin jackets, the iconic hair, the charm. They were masks now, worn to hide a body in quiet collapse. And yet he kept going. Every note, every performance became an act of defiance. Behind the spotlight, he was at war. Not with the critics, not with the past, but with time itself. One night, too weak to sleep, he whispered to Penny, "Not yet. I can't leave them yet. I can't leave you." That was his true fear. Not death, but absence. The idea that his sons, Alistair and Aidan, would grow up without him. That they'd learn to drive, fall in love, face heartbreak, without their father there to guide them. In 2019, when he finally revealed he had beaten prostate cancer, the announcement wasn't made with bravado. It was quiet, humble, and urgent. "I'm in the clear," he said. But he didn't make it about himself. He urged other men to get tested, to not let silence kill them. The crowd erupted, but Rod felt something deeper, the sacred relief of simply being alive. Yet cancer was only part of the toll. Football, his first love, had left its own scars. His knees, shattered from youth, were now metal. His ankle fused. Every step on stage was now victory over pain. "If I can't perform," he once said, "I don't know how to live." That wasn't arrogance. It was truth. The stage wasn't just a place. It was air. Without it, he feared he would wither. So he fought. He sang. He danced. He limped. It wasn't an ending. It was a transition. Rock would give way to swing. Roar would give way to croon. But he would never stop singing. Because music wasn't a career. It was his bloodstream. Behind the scenes, each performance took more than the crowd could imagine. Rehearsals left him breathless. Painkillers dulled the edge, but not the truth. Every step onto that stage was a war. Every note was resistance. To the audience, the sparkle remained. But to Rod, each encore whispered the same question: how many more times? By 2025, Rod Stewart's life stood as both a monument and a mirror, a towering legacy built on melody, but also a quiet reflection of everything it had cost him to keep singing. At nearly 80 years old, his fortune was staggering, estimated at over $300 million. He had sold more than 250 million albums, earned 12 #1 albums, 11 #1 singles, playing on marble floors not built for toys. It was reconciliation with children he once feared he had lost forever. It was the sound of voices, not fans chanting his name, but family calling him dad or granddad. But even as joy returned to his life, even as his home filled with warmth again, the reminders of mortality never faded. His health remained under close watch. Cancer screenings, physical therapy, swimming daily to protect his fused ankle and steel knees. His once legendary indulgences now replaced by moderation and meticulous care. The man who had once toasted the night with champagne now raised his glass in quiet gratitude, savoring each moment not as an escape, but as a gift. The mirror no longer lied. The creases were deeper, the body slower, the exhaustion more pronounced. But in his eyes, there was something stronger than youth, peace, earned, not granted, carved out of heartbreak, hard-won across years of public triumph and private reckoning. And then came the grief. In July 2025, news broke that Ozzy Osbourne, his peer, his countryman, his fellow survivor of rock's wildest decades, had passed away. It wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was a mirror, one more titan fallen, one more reminder that the generation that once shook the world with electric guitars and endless nights was slowly vanishing. Rod spoke softly when asked about it. "It's strange," he said, "to still be standing when so many are gone." He didn't say it with pride. He said it with weight, because survival, too, carries its own sorrow. The applause may continue, but the backstage is quieter now. The phone rings less. The faces at family dinners are younger, unfamiliar with the chaos of his youth. And those who once stood beside him at the edge of glory, many now rest in silence. Rod Stewart had spent a lifetime surrounded by noise, by cheers, music, celebration. But in these later years, he discovered the true wound wasn't from the critics or the surgeries. It was silence, not peaceful but heavy, the kind that comes when old friends stop calling because they're gone. Who lost his first child, who broke hearts and had his own broken. A man who rose and fell and rose again, who beat cancer, but not diminished. In his eyes, the fire remains. He grips the microphone. The band waits. The air holds its breath. And he sings, not because he has to, because he still can. Not because the world demands it, because silence is too close to surrender. And in that final chorus, we don't just hear a man singing. We hear a life lived out loud. We hear every heartbreak, every mistake, every triumph, every scar. We hear resilience. We hear Rod Stewart, not just the icon, not just the knight, but the man who refused to be silenced. And now, or should he keep singing until the very last breath, until the very last note, reminding us that even legends do not fade, they echo? If this story has moved you, share it. Leave a comment, subscribe, and tell us, what's the song that made you fall in love with Rod Stewart's voice? Because in the end, his journey is more than music. It is the mirror of all our battles, with time, with love, with ourselves.